Let's talk about the mightiest Terminator force in the galaxy, clad in the bone-coloured plates of the Dark Angel's veterans. Let's talk Deathwing in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Dark Angels once more, and in this video I thought we'd focus squarely on the Deathwing, seemingly the focus of the new Dark Angels updates this time around. In the video we'll talk briefly about the lore and models for the Deathwing, how they've been in 10th edition so far and previously, go through all the rules for the Inner Circle Task Force, and all the most relevant datasheets that you might want to include in such an army. Loads to talk about for the Hammer of the Unforgiven, so let's jump straight into it. In Warhammer 40k, the lore of the Deathwing is that they're a dreaded and feared Terminator formation of the Dark Angel's first company, descending from their knightly Terminator formations in the Horus Heresy, and they traditionally fight in bone-coloured Terminator armour due to their acceptance of death, all stemming from one particular incident when a Deathwing force notably resigned itself to the grave, though some were able to survive despite impossible odds. In the Dark Angels chapter, they've often found their calling to bring justice to the unrepentant fallen. Often the mobile Raven Wing will scout out their target and track them down, and when the killing blow is needed to be delivered, a teleporting force of Deathwing Terminators comes to destroy the traitors utterly. Ascension to the Deathwing isn't just about fighting spirit, it's also about being inducted into the darkest secrets of the chapter, most notably the fall of half of their chapter during the Horus Heresy. So becoming part of the Deathwing isn't purely a martial ability skill test. The Battle Brother must also be trusted enough to keep these deadly secrets. In the Indomitus era, veterans are often found not just fighting in Terminator armor, and other armor marks are considered part of the Deathwing, such as the ones that fight in the Blade Guard veteran kind of pattern. Though if you think Deathwing in Warhammer 40k, you'd almost certainly think of their Terminator formations first. Miniatures wise in 40k, the Deathwing are represented by 3 different squads plus the generic Terminator armor. Their only truly unique Terminator kit now is the Deathwing Knights here on the left, fighting at close quarters and remarkably hard to take down with their thick storm shields. The standard Deathwing Terminators are represented by an upgrade sprue for the standard Terminator kit, bringing some interesting extra options such as the plasma cannon to the table. And the head of the Deathwing is Grandmaster Belial, bearing the Sword of Silence and an utterly feared Space Marine combatant. I feel like they've done the new Dark Angels Deathwing miniatures really quite nicely, though it certainly was a shame to lose the Terminator Command Squad as an option that you can play in-game. Deathwing have definitely had their ups and downs throughout Warhammer 40k. In 9th edition they were genuinely very intimidating. The Dark Angels Codex came out quite early on, and the Deathwing gained a rule called Inner Circle, meaning that they could only be wounded on a 4+ by enemy weapons, which was massive against the sort of tank hunting type weapons that you'd often be firing at Terminators. You often saw army lists that consisted of something like 30 to 40 Terminators striding into battle, laughing off all firepower, and smashing any enemy units that got close. Throughout probably the majority of 9th edition, it was one of the strongest ways to play Dark Angels. In later 9th edition, they did tone that down with a balance pass, though that didn't last long before the entirety of the rules were rewritten for 10th edition, Terminator plates being a bit tougher with toughness 5 and getting a 4+ invulnerable save built in, so even if they don't have extra defensive rules layered onto their standard Deathwing squads, they're still formidable to take down. In general, people don't tend to run entire armies of Deathwing as much for competitive reasons at least, though it's certainly something that's pretty cool to do and very lore-friendly. Before the Dark Angels Codex, perhaps the most common sight for the Deathwing to be taken to the field in Dark Angels armies were big squads of Deathwing Knights, massively tanky with their -1 damage, and quite a nice target for stratagems and enhancements. With their previous datasheet, you could have, say, 10 of them infiltrating in Vanguard as a bit of a meme list, really. Kind of utterly terrifying to have quite so many big tanky Terminators right in the enemy's face turn 1, though. Things have definitely changed quite a bit for them, though, and their datasheet isn't going to allow that quite as well, given that there's only 5 of them in the squad, not 10. Otherwise, for the most part for the Dark Angels, they haven't been so hugely played, perhaps. All Terminator armies don't really seem to be as much of a thing for Space Marines in 10th edition compared with 9th. It looks like their points costs are having them at the level where they're playable, but maybe not considered competitively optimal by most. Though at least in the new Codex, the Dark Angels have received a formation that tries to make them work about as well as anywhere else would. For the Deathwing in the new Dark Angels Codex, here's the unit list. The core codex has the Deathwing Terminators, Deathwing Knights, and Grandmaster Belial as the mainline Terminator units, and otherwise you get the Deathwing keyword on the Inner Circle Companions, the new mysterious sort of not fallen miniatures in power armor, and all other named characters in the book besides the Lion and Samael. As mentioned, the Strike Master and the Deathwing command squad are unfortunately things of the past. Kind of a shame to lose the command squad with the Apothecary resurrecting Terminators, and the Strike Master could be interesting for lethal hits and maybe even do things like the Fire Discipline combo in Gladius if you wanted to. Otherwise, in any Dark Angels army, as per the Codex, a whole bunch of other units gain the Deathwing keyword. As you'd expect, the Terminator units from the Core Space Marine Codex do, so the standard Terminator squad, the Terminator Assault squad, and the Terminator characters with the Chaplain, Librarian, and Captain. And interestingly, all the veterans get it as well: the Blade Guard and the Blade Guard Ancient, the Stern Guard and the Vanguard Veterans, Land Raiders, Repulsors, and Dreadnoughts as well, though to be honest the keyword for them isn't really all that big, as we'll mention. In the Codex though, the only thing that the Deathwing keyword is really game relevant for, at least in the core rule set for the Dark Angels Codex, are things like Stratagems and Enhancements, and the core rule for the Inner Circle Task Force. All of that's almost entirely exclusive to being focused on the infantry though. The vehicles only can trigger maybe one or two of the rules. Talking of which though, the main force to represent the Deathwing in 40k 10th edition is the Inner Circle Task Force. You could certainly use all the above units in any formation, but if you want to build an army that does majorly centre around the Terminators, I feel like it is probably one of the best bets, perhaps partly due to the First Company Task Force from the Core Space Marine Codex being kind of underpowered. From initial impressions of the Codex, I feel like out of the 3 detachments, it's probably this one and the Raven Wing ones that are the most interesting. The Unforgiven Task Force maybe does have surprisingly lacklustre rules in my opinion, but I think there's quite a lot to like about the Inner Circle Task Force: a handy enough damage dealer core rule, a couple of really powerful stratagems, and a few useful enhancements, particularly nice with the first turn deep strike one. The core rule of the detachment is called Vowed Target, which is sort of like a supplemental damage boost to your Oath of Moment, as well as nominating one enemy unit for rerolls to hit against in the command phase. You also get to nominate one objective marker. Any enemy units that are within range of that objective marker, you get a +1 to wound against those when you attack them with Deathwing infantry, either at range or in melee. That one does feel pretty meaningful and useful to me. Sure, it does mean that your opponent might be able to just choose not to put their main threats on objectives if they want to avoid the rule, but in general, if your opponent wants to score any primary points, they are going to have to move up to objective markers. And in theory, if they are absolutely trying to dogpile one objective with lots of units, you might be able to have this boost go off on quite a lot of your attacks. You could maybe combine it with Oath of Moment as well if there was a seriously big target, like say an Imperial Chaos Titanic Knight to take down. You could have your units reroll all hit rolls against that target, and when they attack them they get +1 to wound as well. Seems pretty nice with things like Terminator Stormbolters or Power Fists. Even the Power Fists might be often wounding things on a 5+, so that's really big for them. And it is kind of interesting that you could potentially get this rule to trigger with a whole bunch of other units as well, just by giving things like Asmodai or Ezekiel the option to lead certain units. They'd be able to give that squad the Deathwing keyword, so you'd potentially be able to get the +1 to wound for things like Hellblasters or Assault Intercessors, for example, things that aren't even traditionally veterans or anything. Overall, it does feel like something that you'd reliably get at least some value out of each game. That will probably be a lot more meaningful against armies with big tanky things trying to hold objectives with sheer might, as opposed to more guerrilla warfare style armies when any individual part of them could be kind of expendable. Moving on to the stratagems, and for one command point there's Martial Mastery. This one allows Deathwing infantry units to reroll wound rolls of 1 in melee, going up to reroll all wound rolls against any targets on your vowed objective. Most of the time I wouldn't really rate a reroll 1s to wound as a particularly good damage boost for 1 CP, unless literally every bit of damage is absolutely critical and will change the combat. 4 reroll wounds is pretty nice though. I could imagine that being pretty effective with say Blade Guard or Terminators charging into something on an objective. You could have Terminators wounding something on a toughness 12 with a 4+, and then re-rolling the wound roll, converting the vast majority of your successful hits to successful wounds. Definitely means they can bring the focal damage when they need to, particularly if combined with Oath of Moment. For 1 CP, there's Duty Unto Death. This one's a 4+ chance to fight on death when the unit's slain if they haven't already fought, and you get a +1 to the roll if you're on the vowed objective. I wouldn't say that this one's maybe one of the most exciting ones out there, but it's potentially interesting enough if you had a big scary veteran unit that was just about to get wiped out by a whole bunch of enemies charging them. I guess it would mean that you'd get a certain proportion of the unit's melee damage back, and it might be best against enemy units that do deal good damage but also aren't really that hard to kill in return. For 1 CP there's Relic Teleportarium. This one allows a Deathwing unit deep striking to do so anywhere that's greater than 3 inches from the enemy, and they can't charge after, as per standard with those rules. Potentially that could mean that you could land a 10-man Terminator unit into the enemy backfield, which would be very scary. Maybe light up a whole load of enemy light infantry with a bunch of Stormbolter fire and put a few Cyclone missile launchers where they're most needed. And potentially could be handy for secondary objective things, maybe sneaking on to primary objectives if the opponent hasn't deployed centrally on them, or getting in the right place to do things like behind enemy lines or deploy teleport homers if that's the best use of it. I guess in theory you could use that to affect Vanguard veterans, but I feel like Terminators are probably going to be the better choice for that given that they've got some more meaningful shooting. For 1 CP, there's Wrath of the Lion. Mortal wound impact hits when a Deathwing infantry unit charges in. Roll 1 dice for each model in your unit. For each 4+ you deal a mortal wound, and that goes up to a 3+ on the Vowed objective, though it is capped out at a maximum of 3 mortal wounds, which sort of limits its potential. I feel like from 1 command point occasion that will be worth it if you're targeting something with very high toughness and high armor and good invulnerable saves and things, provided you're charging in with something like a squad of 5 or above. Probably situationally helpful. I'm not sure I'd really rate it as outstanding for just sheer damage value for 1 CP though. You might get better return on damage from grenades or tank shock with certain units. Otherwise, for 1 CP, there's Armor of Contempt, worsening enemy AP by 1, always nice with Terminators or maybe Land Raiders, simple and reliable and good for Space Marines. And then finally for 1 command point, there's Unmatched Fortitude, which that one is a battle tactic, so you could get it for free with Captains. When your Deathwing infantry unit is shot by the enemy, they become -1 to wound for weapons where their strength is greater than your toughness, so often 6 or more for Terminators I guess. That could make you go from being wounded on a 3 to a 4 or a 2 to a 3. Again, I suppose that's another handy enough reactive durability boost, maybe most useful for things like Terminators where they're going to be on their invulnerable save either way, but you still want to give them every chance of surviving with a stratagem. Kind of nice to have that as another option as a result, though a lot of the time Armor of Contempt might be the better way to go. Overall, I feel like as stratagem sections go, it's not a terrible one. I feel like perhaps my favourite single one is Relic Teleportarium to allow units to deep strike anywhere at 3 inches. That one's always a big power move, and for the rest of them I feel like most of them are absolutely fine in the right situation. Unmatched Fortitude is a nice alternative to make them tougher as an alternative to Armor of Contempt, and Martial Mastery could be genuinely meaningful for allowing a Terminator unit to charge and kill something that they might have really struggled against. Otherwise, for enhancements, perhaps my single favourite is Deathwing Assault for 30 points as printed in the Codex. That affects a Deathwing model with Deep Strike and allows you to Deep Strike in turn 1 during your movement phase. So basically a 9-inch drop. You wouldn't be able to use Rapid Ingress with it, though I believe that you will be able to use the Relic Teleportarium if you really wanted to. You could potentially have Deathwing units right up close and personal with the enemy army. To me this does just seem like a very scary threat to position a big unit turn 1. You could maybe drop them down into a midfield ruin, or put them against some enemy units that aren't going to be able to threaten them too well. If you can budget a command point reroll on the 9-inch drop, then you have around about a 50-50 chance of making a first turn charge, which could be absolutely game changing and kill a whole extra unit. Otherwise, I guess perhaps the best use of that would be a big squad with a whole load of firepower, so they can actually threaten something at least, a bunch of Stormbolters and some Cyclones perhaps. Otherwise, for 15 points, there's Champion of the Deathwing, 15 points on the Codex for that one. That gives the bearer's attacks lethal hits and critical hits on a 5+ if they're on the Vowed objective. Lethal hits definitely isn't awful, but at 15 points I think is a bit on the borderline side really. Probably going to be most meaningful on the Terminator Captain given that he's got the best melee with a bit of AP. Though I think I'd see that as a bit more of a points filler as opposed to something to go out of your way to get. Otherwise, Eye of the Unseen I think is genuinely great provided you don't actually have Azrael in your unit already. If you've got a character in a big Deathwing Terminator unit that you might well be repeatedly using stratagems on, this gives you a 5+ chance to regain a CP if you spend a stratagem on the unit, going up to a 4+ on the Vowed objective. If it does wind up being this cheap in the digital points cost, then that seems reasonable to have for a small chance of getting some CP back, though it is redundant if you have the excellent Azrael on the board, as he'll be farming you your command point for the game turn anyway, and you can't get more than 1 extra one from any source per battle round. Finally, there's Singular Will, which is 20 points as printed in the Codex. That gives you Pile In or Consolidate for an additional 3 inches for the bearer's unit, kind of handy enough to help them get into melee I guess. Again, I feel like at 20 points this one's hard to be too excited about, though it's not awful. Likely best if you can have a big Terminator unit jump into the enemy army, destroy one of their units, and then this might make the difference between whether or not you can contact and pile into the next units that might not want to be in combat, disrupting enemy shooting or making them fall back. It could also potentially help you snag objectives as well. Overall, out of the enhancements, I feel like all of them are okay for the cost, I feel like Deathwing Assault is really the only one that I'd go for a standout one though, that looks like I'd want to include in the army for definite. The other ones all give you some minor advantages that could just be used to finish up an army list that just has a few more points left to fill it. A little bit of extra damage, a bit more consolidation, or some command point farming if you don't have Azrael. Getting into datasheets for the Deathwing though, and they have plenty of different options now that they have both Terminator squads plus access to veteran units. Starting with the iconic Deathwing Terminators, pre-Codex these were 200 points per 5 of them, though at time of recording we've yet to see the Minotaur and Field manual as it will come out for the Dark Angels Codex. These guys got a lot more convergent with the standard Space Marine Terminator squad when their unit was released. Unfortunately, they can't mix and match the Terminator Assault Squad gear anymore, so you are going to be having the Stormbolters and Power Fists and heavy weapons. I think I'll be most likely to want to take them with a big unit with Cyclone missile launchers and a bunch of Power Fists. Now you can only take the Deathwing Knights in 5, they seem like a particularly good choice for making good use out of stratagems and enhancements. It could be a good unit to drop at 3 inches. Otherwise, compared with standard Terminators, they have 3 different rules advantages. A Watcher in the Dark for a once per game, 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds. Really not too bad given that that's one of the more efficient ways to kill them with their big saves and invulnerables. They have the option of a plasma cannon, though honestly I wouldn't really rate it compared with the Cyclone missile launcher. That one broadly gets better damage and doesn't threaten to kill you quite so much. And finally, their Deathwing rule is slightly better than the standard Terminator Fury of the First special rule, as well as getting +1 to hit the Oath of Moment targets, they also get to ignore weapon skill and hit roll modifiers, which could be big against certain armies. I think for determining which Terminator squads you choose to play around with though, it's going to depend on points quite heavily. The regular Terminator squad prior to any balanced data slate thing is 185 points for 5, and you're going to have to look at the points differential between the regular Terminator squad and the Deathwing one, and decide whether or not the Watcher and the Ignores modifiers is really going to be worth however many more points they cost. I'd hope they wind up costing about the same. For a 5 or 10 point differential, I feel like you could justify upgrading to the Deathwing squad. Any more than that, and I sort of feel like you might be investing too many points in Ignores modifiers and the Watcher. Otherwise, for Deathwing datasheets, we have the Deathwing Knights. Pre-Codex, these were 235 points or 470. Their printed cost in the Codex was 290, which is kind of meaningless because it will get superseded by the Minotaur and Field manual. And if anything, given their updates, I'd probably expect them to go down slightly from 235, not up. In general, we're seeing their datasheet, despite their cool new miniatures. People are really quite down on the rules of the Deathwing Knights on first impressions. They certainly don't hit quite as hard as they used to. The basic guys either get 4 attacks at strength 6, AP -1, damage 2 with their maces, or 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1 with the power weapons. Profiles that both have their advantages in my opinion. The mace will do generally a little bit better against most multi-wound things, though the power weapons will clear hordes better and be a little bit more impressive against anything that's got high saves. Otherwise, the Sergeant gets a flail or a relic weapon, a whole bunch of AP 2 and damage 2 attacks whichever way you go for, the flail getting devastating wounds and sustained hits, and the relic weapon getting lethal hits. Again, I feel like both of those are at least fairly well balanced. Again, they get the Watcher in the Dark, and they've got really quite a tanky profile, having 4 wounds due to their storm shields, and then a -1 damage rule from Inner Circle. It means that they're spectacularly quite tanky against damage 2 weapons that would usually go through them pretty quickly. And that's genuinely pretty huge for making these guys into the tanky Terminator squad, where you just want to skew really highly towards durability. Being locked to only 5 models is definitely a disadvantage though. It means that stratagems and enhancements and things aren't quite as good on these as they used to be when you could take them in an enormous unit, and they're going to be fielded in smaller squads that could just be really quite hard to kill and could be quite nice as sort of like outlying units to the army. Still sufficient melee to absolutely bully lighter threats, and could be very hard for more isolated units to take them out on their own. Overall, how strong they are though is definitely going to depend on the points. I feel like lots of people are being kind of hyperbolic about how bad these guys are. If they're pointed at something like around 210 points, I think they could still be very, very interesting. They're spectacularly tanky, and particularly with the detachment support, they could still be taking down lots of enemies for their cost. Otherwise, for Grandmaster Belial, with his fun new model, he was 85 points. And it still looks like he might be a bit of a niche character out there. He basically has the stat line of a slightly upgraded Terminator captain, with a damage 2 Stormbolter and 6 attacks at strength 6 damage 2, all with precision. He's basically the model that helps your unit with sniping enemy characters as he gets all those attacks, and then any critical hits by his lead squad gets precision for taking out enemy characters. Kind of a bit hit and miss that one. In some games it could be absolutely massive, though in some games it's not going to matter at all. Kind of depends whether you want to take the hit of having a Terminator captain or something that has a bit more reliable utility whenever you fight with him. He does get strikes of retribution as well, which means that when he's directly targeted in melee, the enemy has a good chance to take a bunch of mortal wounds. If they're just being hit in any great numbers, then they'll probably average around about 3 mortal wounds back at the enemy, which definitely isn't nothing. It does have the downside of meaning that his squad will basically have to be destroyed for that rule to take effect, though. Overall, if he did remain at 85 points, I think it's kind of fine, and in some games could genuinely be really quite important for sniping out key support characters straight out of a squad that should protect them. In other games, though, you're probably going to wish that you had something that was just a bit more general purpose. Lastly, for the core Terminator units, we've got the Terminator Assault Squad. A little bit pricier than the regular Terminators, but they do get their 4 wounds with the Storm Shields, and I'd be most tempted to fill them with their devastating wound Thunderhammers with a bunch of straight 8 and damage 2 hits. Will be interesting to see how they wind up versus the Deathwing Knights. Per model, the Deathwing Knights are massively tankier than these guys, and a fair bit better against standard Space Marines or lighter infantry. That Sergeant Relic weapon doing a lot of the work for their damage output, but these guys have an edge against certain high toughness targets, and devastating wounds are nice. Otherwise, for Terminator characters, there's the Chaplain Terminator armor, a nice simple +1 to wound, and a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, which has some overlap with the Watcher. I feel like in general he's quite a good choice for leading Terminators, though I suppose the +1 to wound could also overlap with the detachment rule, perhaps making him just a little bit less tempting in the Deathwing force than some other places. The Librarian 75 points as well, and gives you sustained hits 1 for your unit, maybe particularly nice for a unit that's both got ranged and combat weapons, as it means that you could buff both of them rather than just boosting their melee. Could be nice for a massed up unit of standard Terminators perhaps, plus he has a little bit of damage dealing at range with his smite as well. Finally, for the generic Terminator characters, we've got the Terminator Captain. He can lead the standard Terminator units and will be able to attach to the Deathwing ones as well. He's got the best melee profile out of the generic characters, with fire attacks at strength 8 and damage 2 with a power fist. He gives you reroll charges, which could be pretty good for getting any units at 9 inches to charge in, and then gets his free battle tactics stratagem, which I feel like is maybe not as good as some in this detachment. You'd basically be using it on the durability stratagems, armor of contempt, or the -1 to wound, or I guess throwing it into something like a wound reroll if you've not got anything else better to use it on. Doesn't seem awful, and the reroll charge thing is definitely handy, but perhaps not quite as standout here as he might be in certain other detachments. That's the Terminators, which I'd certainly consider the main iconic force of the Deathwing, but besides that we've got the Inner Circle Companions, a squad that I think would genuinely have to be kind of cheap to be good, probably around about the 80 point sort of mark before they'd start getting looked at too seriously. They could definitely make some good use of the detachment rule for +1 to wound though, with targeting things on objectives. It means that even if their attacks were all damage 1, that between lethal hits and the +1 to wound, they should be stacking some saves. Blade Guard veterans have often been fielded in Deathwing colours over the past year or so. Again, +1 to wound works out very nicely with their mastercrafted power weapons. I think they'd really quite like the -1 to wound stratagem as well, given that they'd usually be saving on their invulnerable saves with their storm shields. Vanguard veterans could potentially make use of some teleporting Deathwing type things. I guess in theory you could have a unit do a 3-inch drop with the stratagem, though to be honest I feel like at that point you're probably just better off taking Inceptors, where their damage is skewed to shooting, not melee. But otherwise I guess could be handy enough to have a fast moving unit that threatens to be able to use the stratagems and things. And finally, Stern Guard veterans feel like they'd be quite useful with the +1 to wound. Their Stern Guard bolt rifles can put out quite a lot of strength 4 AP -1 shots. Extra wounding does seem like a good use for them. A bit overcosted at the 100 points that they've been though. Hopefully Games Workshop takes them down in balanced data slate points changes at some point. Coming back to the Deathwing vehicles, as mentioned, Land Raiders, Repulsors, Repulsor Executioners, and all Dreadnought types all gain the Deathwing keyword, though kind of unfortunately it just doesn't really work with any of the synergies of the detachments. I guess it's a keyword for a bit more lore and theming sort of purposes, as opposed to really being an in-game rule effect. The detachment rule only gives the +1 to wound for infantry, and the vast majority of stratagems are locked to infantry only as well. The only one that isn't armor of contempt that you can use on the vehicles is 1 command point for duty unto death, for a 4+ chance to fight on death in melee. I guess theoretically, if you had like a Redemptor Brutalis or something, then I guess that could well be worth it, but it's still going to be a coin flip even if the opponent does kill it. You're probably more likely to get more value out of things like Armor of Contempt or Smoke. The datasheets themselves, though, are all solid enough. The Ballistas and the Redemptor tend to be really quite common competitive picks. Repulsors and Repulsor Executioners can do some good firepower, and Land Raiders can genuinely be an interesting way to get a squad into combat at long range. You'd have to go for a smaller 5-man Terminator unit, maybe with a character attached though if you wanted to do that, though I guess in theory they could deliver Deathwing Knights. Otherwise, as I briefly mentioned before as well, the core Dark Angels characters like Azrael or Asmodai or Lazarus or Ezekiel, all of those come with a Deathwing keyword, and they could potentially give the keyword to units that they lead. That means that you could target those units with stratagems, and you could also trigger the detachment rule for them. Perhaps the single most obvious one here could be Hellblasters getting a +1 to wound with Azrael on toe, and potentially be just a massive threat with all that plasma fire just to blitz enemies off objectives if they step into the midfield ones. Azrael's just already great in himself farming those command points, but he seems like he's very well suited to the Hellblasters otherwise, giving them sustained hits and a 4+ invulnerable save to make them more tanky. And the -1 to wound stratagem could be another durability boost to them. You could have a surprisingly tanky unit there. Otherwise, could be fun for the Infernus squads, or the Intercessors, or the Assault Intercessors. Again, the chance for a +1 to wound is pretty fun. Ezekiel and Asmodai, I think, are both usable, though don't feel anywhere near as standout as Azrael is, though Lazarus feels hard to justify compared with the competition, really. I suppose if you're charging into melee, then a +1 CP for a whole bunch of mortal wound impact hits could be nice as well. I guess that could be meaningful in a big ranked top squad if you did just need that extra punch when you throw yourselves into combat. Otherwise, while we're on the subject of Deathwing and particularly Terminators teleporting in, probably worth mentioning Rapid Ingress as well. Terminators with big beefy stat lines and the Deep Strike special rule might be a good way to use that, given that it could deliver them into somewhere safe, and then they can go on to make a very easy charge the following turn. Rapid Ingress is the 1 command point reserves thing. You use it after the enemy movement, and then the idea would be to drop a Terminator unit somewhere that the opponent can't deal too much damage to it. Say if you're playing against an Ultramarine player here, you could drop the Deathwing Knights into a line of sight blocking ruin, somewhere potentially quite close to the enemy Space Marines, but not able to be shot due to you knowing exactly where those units will be. And then in your own turn, you can move another 5 inches forward and then threaten a charge. You could be potentially charging at a much closer range than the standard 9 inches and have a lot better chance of making melee. If you are deep striking things, could well be the better option as opposed to just risking a 9-inch charge even with a command point reroll. Just to try and tie things together a little bit, I thought it could be interesting to just draft a very rough army list. The points used here are based on the pre-Codex download points. I take this more of an idea than anything else. It might be that a few of these choices go down in cost with the next balance update, though I guess certain things could go up. I've tried to keep this with a hefty core of the actual Deathwing Terminators, and there's 20 of them here. There's a Terminator Captain with Deathwing Assault for the first turn Deep Strike. He is with the main big Terminator squad. 2 Cyclone missile launchers with the Power Fist and the Watcher in the Dark, and they'll aim to drop turn 1, probably at 9-inch range unless it makes sense to go 3 inches for some reason, hit the enemy with a whole bunch of firepower with Stormbolters and Cyclones, and then have a re-rollable charge to have a chance at making a first turn melee. Even then it is going to be a 50-50, so I wouldn't plan for it, but a coin flip chance at probably just outright deleting another enemy unit is better than nothing. There's then a unit of Deathwing Knights headed up by a Terminator Chaplain. He takes the Champion of the Deathwing enhancement for a few more personal lethal hits, and hopefully the permanent +1 to wound will help mean that the Knights can punch up and threaten things a bit tougher while they tank enemy hits. There's then a Terminator Librarian with another unit of regular Deathwing Terminators, a squad of 5 of them here. These would be one that I'd hopefully think about teleporting sometime later in the game, maybe using the 3-inch Deep Strike ability to put them somewhere in the enemy deployment zone or somewhere they're going to be hard to deal with. And with the Librarian sustained hits, they should be a little bit shootier than they would be otherwise, particularly with the Smite as well. Then for a big shooting on the board threat, there's Azrael leading up a unit of 10 Hellblasters. They'd ideally want to start in cover and then move out of cover to gun down something that the enemy puts in the midfield, ideally on a midfield objective for the big +1 to wound if possible. And then at least Azrael and them should be kind of hard to take out with the 4+ invulnerable, and maybe using the -1 to wound if necessary. Finally, to support them, there's a single unit of scouts to have some presence in the midfield. 2 units of Inceptors with Plasma to deep strike for secondaries as necessary, but could also just come down and provide some massive pinpoint damage. They could even go with the Deathwing units using the 3-inch deep strike if necessary. A single unit of 5 Infiltrators likely to hold the home objective if it makes sense to, and you need to defend against enemy deep strikers. And then a single Ballistus Dreadnought, just providing a bit more long-range fire support between missiles and las cannons to hopefully help you take down the hardest threats that the enemy has. Between that and a few Cyclone missile launchers hopefully should have some okay chance of taking down a tank. And potentially in matchups where it made sense to, you could put the Infiltrators and Scouts in the midboard and just have him hold the home field objective if he'd be safe to do so. In any case, will be interesting to see what people actually come up with when we do get the final points for these. Hopefully the Deathwing and the Inner Circle Task Force can have some sort of play on the tabletop in the competitive game. It really is going to be very dependent on the points cost for Terminators though. So anyway though, let me know your thoughts on the Hammer of the Unforgiven in 10th edition 40k. What are your plans for getting Deathwing Terminators painted up and on the tabletop? Or can you see them being relegated to the shelf at present? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel as well, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.